I don't think it's controversial to say that the best things in life tend to be pretty simple. Things like blue jeans that fit exactly the way you want them to, puffy white clouds and a light breeze, home-cooked meals, old friends. And the thing about these simple pleasures is how strongly they contrast with all the cumbersome complexity and intricacies of life. But the thing about the world is when you break them down to their component parts, most things turn out to be really simple, which is why when you read, you begin with ABC, and you sing, you begin with do, re, mi. And I'm not going to do a Julie Andrews number, but these principles really do lay the foundation for everything that comes after them. The Library of Congress is filled with 51 million books, which I tried to figure out the math on how many miles of bookshelves that was and came up empty on that. But it's a lot of books. But of those 51 million books, all of them are written with the same 26 letters. There's over 100 million songs on Spotify. All of them are made with the same 12 notes. And the 8.6-ish million species that exist, all of their DNA comes from 4 chemical bases. So the more complex things get, the more simple it becomes at its fundamental basis. And disability ministry is no different than any of this. But for many church leaders, disability itself seems like something that is entirely and unapproachably complex. And if you don't believe me, I want to read some of the things that we may hear in the church. Is this the clicker? How do I go? Okay. Whoop. Here's something that you might find on the Social Security website, as they are helpfully trying to give you the diagnostic criteria for disorder 1006A. And I apologize in advance to the sign language interpreters for what's about to happen. To find that your disorder meets 1006A, we need a copy of the laboratory report of karyotype analysis, which is the definitive test to establish non-mosaic Down syndrome. We will not accept a fluorescence in situ hybridization test because it does not distinguish between the mosaic and non-mosaic forms of Down syndrome. Everybody tracking so far? We get all that? I did not get any of that, hardly any of that. Maybe Steve Gersovich, MD, might have tracked with some of that. But for most of us in the room, even those that have a background in disability, this is just Dr. Seuss gobbledygook. It doesn't mean anything to us. It doesn't help us get any closer to understanding this. Let's take a look, perhaps, at a few of the acronyms that we might find in special education. If you can tell me which of these are fake, I'll give you $5. Because this list could have been a lot longer. We've got ADA, which probably most of us know, OCR, OEO, SELPA, LMNOP, QRSTUV. The list goes on. And so my point in all of this is that when this is how disability is engaged with in the world at large, when we encounter disability through a medical context, through a special education context, through government services, the jargon and the acronyms and the foreign Latin words make it seem unapproachably complex, which puts us in a weird spot for church leaders. A Lifeway research poll from March of 2020 found that 99% of Protestant pastors believed that their church, or that for people coming to visit their church, they would feel welcomed. But the lived experience of people with disabilities, perhaps in this room, would contradict that experience. 99% of churches are not welcoming to people with disabilities. But what do we do with this information? How do we understand this self-reporting on behalf of the pastors? Were they lying? Were they mistaken? I don't know. I don't think so. I think these pastors really believed that to be true, and more importantly, I think that they really deeply, desperately want it to be true. But when you've got a pastor who's caught between the rock and the hard place of wanting to be a place of welcome for people with disabilities and feeling completely alienated and isolated because of phrases like fluorescence in situ hybridization and that wall of letters, what happens when you get squeezed between those things? I think there are 3 main reactions that we might have to this. The first reaction might be that the pastors suggest or determine that because they have the correct attitude and because they want to be welcoming, that they've checked that box and they're just fine. The second reaction might be that in good faith, a pastor believing, well, we don't really know what to do with disability, but we know the church down the street does. They might think that the best and most loving thing would be to simply refer somebody from their church to a church that is equipped for them. And the third possible reaction might be that they conclude that they need to become experts on disability, or they need to find and hire somebody who is an expert on disability in order to establish a distinct and discrete ministry within the church. And this person winds up, more often than not, being either a parent of a child with a disability, a special ed teacher, or a behavioral therapist, or something along those lines. But each of these things, I think, ultimately is insufficient for what the church is called to do. As we come to understand, though, the ABCs, the do-re-mis of disability ministry, as we start to unravel this complexity, I think churches will genuinely be able to live up to that desire that they have to be a place of welcoming for disabilities. So I want to establish for us today a couple simple first principles that will allow us to start building back the necessary complexity. Because I want to be clear, despite the provocative title of Stop Starting Disability Ministries are great, and there's a lot of churches that benefit from them. But when you start with the complexity and you don't build into it, that's where we run into problems. So some of those first principles that I think we need to begin with are very simple. One, people with disabilities need the church. This one is uncontroversially true, which is the good news that we start in a point of total agreement, I think. Everybody agrees. The second point, that the church needs people with disabilities, is again something that people agree with, at least in principle. But it's the third point where I think we run into the biggest problem and the greatest hurdle to understanding. And that is that people with disabilities face barriers to being a part of most churches. Now, this one people always see in part. For instance, nobody is baffled by the fact that a wheelchair user, when confronting a staircase, is likely to run into some problems. But there are so many more barriers that are entirely invisible, that have nothing to do with the physical architecture, and in some cases have nothing to do with the church themselves, but might be within the heart of the person with a disability. And this gives us a bit of a dilemma. How can a church possibly deal with barriers that they don't know exist? By definition, you don't know what you don't know. And for most of us at this conference, raising awareness is a key piece of what we do. But I want to propose that there is a systematic way that churches can go about finding barriers and dealing with them. Because while no two churches are the same and have their own unique sets of barriers, I believe that a house church, a rural chapel, a megachurch can all follow the same path when it comes to discerning how they can proactively welcome people with disabilities. As it turns out, I think that having the right answers is far less important than learning to ask the right questions. So, let's see. These are the three steps that we need to do. To one, find where there are barriers. Two, identify the barriers, name it, identify the nature of the barrier. And then three, deal with the barrier. And that last one is where we may have disability ministries emerge or where we may not have them emerge. So step one is very simple. To start, you simply ask people where they experience barriers in the church. You can begin with those who are in your church, and there's probably some that they have that are top of mind. But as you begin by thinking about those in your church, which is absolutely where you should belong, we need to recognize that there's already an there's already an existing bias for asking those people questions. During World War II, there was a project among engineers where they looked at the bombers that were returning from the front, and they were looking at where the clusters of gunfire was on the ships themselves. And they had initially concluded we should more heavily armor the parts that are getting shot. But what they had initially overlooked was these were the ones that were coming back. These were the ones that had survived the anti-aircraft fire, the ones that were getting shot down over, the battlefields of France and Germany. They were probably getting shot in the other places. So as important as it is for us to begin with those who are in our churches, we also need to then look beyond that and say, who's not even in our church in the first place? But a systematic way where we can identify this is by figuring out first, what does it mean to be a part of your church? And this thing might be 3 things, it might be 5 things, it might be 10 things, and there's not a right or a wrong answer. But once you have that list of things and saying, this is what it means to be a fully engaged member of our church, you can then simply compare against the people who are actually in your church and see, all right, we've got 3 out of 5, what's happening here? Because whatever's preventing those 2 areas of participation from happening is evidence of some kind of barrier, which then leads to step 2, to identify where that barrier is. And then thirdly, dealing with that barrier. But let's add a little color to this because this is all hypothetical nonsense so far. Imagine there's a man named Bob, And Bob he's an adult with a moderate intellectual disability, and he loves his church. He participates in everything that he can possibly be a part of. Every Sunday, he's there front and center, singing the loudest, high-fiving people, shaking hands, and he does a lot of things in the church. But there are two areas that the church leaders, when they compare against the ideal and what Bob's actually doing, where we find that Bob isn't serving anywhere in the church, and Bob isn't a part of a small group in the church. And as the church investigates this, they come to realize that the reason why Bob isn't in a small group is that he relies on public transportation, and all of the small groups, being in the suburbs, don't have public transportation running near enough for Bob to be able to take the city bus to get to one of those small groups. They find out that the reason why he's not serving anywhere is that Bob has internalized this belief that because of his disability, he simply doesn't have anything to contribute or offer to the church, and so he holds back. So in the first case, there's a very simple a very simple solution to getting Bob into a small group, and that's to set up a carpool for him. In the second case, Bob needs someone to walk alongside of him to point out the ways in which God has already gifted him and is working in him and through him, and then encouraging him to use that gift in the context of the church. And this is what disability ministry is. You'll notice that it doesn't necessarily involve a program, unless you count carpools as a program. And while programs can be helpful and experts have valuable insights, Bob doesn't need a program, and he doesn't need someone with letters after their name to figure out that he needs some extra encouragement to find his gifting and to use it within the context of the church. So programs are helpful, but they're not required in every or all situations. And this leads me to my conclusion that we need to stop starting disability ministries and start ministering to people with disabilities. In my own experience, I had a student with autism who could never seem to focus during the time of teaching. And I had made the assumption pretty quickly that because teaching was the last thing we did for the day, that he was just about tapped out for the day, and his inability to sit still or focus had more to do with him being ready to go home than anything else. But after weeks and weeks of him continually moving in his chair and making noises and flexing his hands, I finally asked him, I said, "What's wrong?" And he pointed behind me at the whiteboard on which I often drew stick figures to illustrate the lesson, and he said, "None of your stick figures have noses on their faces." And I was like, well, that's true. So I got my little expo marker and I drew 2 lines, just little greater than or less than signs on their faces, and he immediately calmed down and started focusing on the lesson. And it blew my mind. I have, to this day, no idea why it didn't bother him that they didn't have eyebrows or teeth or fingers or hair or ears, but for him, it was noses, and that was the kicker. And because I had spent so long assuming that I had the right answer, that it had prevented me from asking the right question. And the right question and the barrier that stood between him focusing on the lesson and him being a disruption to himself and to other people was literally 2 lines of an expo marker. And that makes me ask the question, how many churches are in a similar position of wanting sincerely to be a place of welcome to people with disabilities, but allowing barriers to persist because they don't know what they don't know, and they don't know how to ask the right questions? And so this process of, again, finding where there are barriers, identifying those barriers, and dealing with those barriers needs to be genuinely collaborative. While individuals or parents of children with disabilities provide valuable firsthand knowledge about their needs and their experiences, pastors ultimately have to contribute to that conversation too. They can't take a backseat or a hands-off approach of you tell me, because pastors are shepherds. They're the ones that provide spiritual leadership and guidance. 1 Thessalonians 5:14, did I make a slide from that? Yes, I did. And we urge you, brothers, admonish the idle, encourage the faint-hearted, help the weak, be patient with them all. And a while back, I was mentoring a young man with a disability, and he'd learned this neat little trick whenever there was something he didn't want to do, that people would ask him to do something, and he would say, "Oh, I can't do that. I have a disability." And then they would let him off the hook 9 times out of 10. And this was a case in which admonish the idle was called for. He needed to be pushed. He needed to be challenged in that moment to go beyond what he thought he wanted to do or thought he was capable of. But on the other hand, there are scenarios in which encourage the faint-hearted and help the weak are called for. And if you are admonishing and pushing somebody who's already faint-hearted and weak, you might just knock them over. So knowing the difference between which one of these things you're going to apply into a given situation requires a level of relationship that programs can sometimes paper over. So every church is called to make disciples of people with disabilities, but not every person with a disability will want or need a program to make that happen. And this is in one sense freeing. Small churches are not necessarily worse off because of their lack of budget or volunteer base, but on the other hand, it means that you can't just microwave disability ministry. You can't hit Control-C, Control-V, and expect everything to go swimmingly in that scenario, because plug-and-play options won't necessarily work because your church is unique. The people that are in your church are unique. God has called each and every individual into a relationship with himself and tasked the church with that common mission of making disciples. And this frees us from having to start disability ministries, but it requires us to start doing disability ministry. And so when we work backwards from these first principles, it leads you towards the particularities of your church, with your context and your people. When we begin with the first principles that people with disabilities need the church and the church needs people with disabilities, it becomes essential to the faithful execution of the church's mission to find, identify, and deal with barriers. This goes far beyond starting a disability ministry, although that very well may be an outcome and part of the solution. And there are many great things that disability ministry can look like, but it can never be less than making disciples. By getting back to the basic and learning to ask the right questions, we can ensure that these disciples include people with disabilities and that we are faithful to fulfill our mission. And it's simple, but it's not easy. None of these things we've talked about today have been complex. None of them are unique or specialized. None of them require you to have a PhD in order to get them. But when we return to the simplicity, we are then able to build and create things that are custom. We are able to write new stories with those 26 letters. We are able to sing new songs with those 12 notes. And we are able to bring disability from the periphery of church into the center of church life. And if Christ believed that people with disabilities were worth dying for, then they are worth the church's every effort. Thank you, guys.